Somewhere off the southern coast of Alaska, under freezing gray water, there is a door. It is not a real door. It is a place in the earth where two giant slabs of rock are locked together, bolted shut, while something enormous pushes on the other side. That door has not opened in more than 50 years. And in the last few years, it has started to shake. To put the size of that locked patch into perspective before we even start, imagine a rectangle of ocean floor roughly the length of the entire state of Rhode Island stacked end to end with New Jersey, sitting a few miles beneath the waves, held in place by nothing but friction, while the plate underneath it never once stops pushing. This is the Alaska Peninsula. It sits right in the middle of the most active earthquake zone on the planet, the Ring of Fire. If you lined up every major fault system that circles the Pacific Ocean, end to end, it would stretch further than the distance from New York to Tokyo and back. And tucked into that ring, off a stretch of coastline most people couldn't find on a map, is a gap, not a crack. A gap. A patch of fault that everyone around it has already broken, but that this one section has not. I know the title of this video sounds like a doomsday countdown. The most dangerous gap on the Ring of Fire just woke up. And I get it, that sounds like a script for a disaster movie, but that's not quite the full picture, and I want to be upfront with you right at the start. This isn't about a date. Nobody can tell you a date. This is about a pattern, a real measured physical pattern, and about what happens when a piece of the Earth's crust runs out of room to keep hiding. By the end of this video, you're going to understand three things. First, what a seismic gap actually is, and why scientists treat an area that hasn't shaken in a long time as more dangerous than an area that shakes all the time. Second, how researchers actually found this specific gap, which is a genuinely strange detective story involving decades of quiet data nobody was paying attention to. And third, what this means if you live near a coastline, any coastline, not just this one, because the lessons here apply almost everywhere the ocean meets a subduction zone. And here's the deal I want to make with you before we go further. The next several minutes are going to be the hard part. I'm going to walk you through the scary mechanics first, the stuff that might make your stomach drop a little. I'm doing that on purpose. If I gave you the reassuring stuff first, you'd relax too early and miss why it matters. So stick with me through the uncomfortable part, because I promise you, this video ends in a place that is genuinely useful, not just genuinely unsettling. All right. Tell me in the comments which coastline is closest to you, and I'll tell you if it sits on a subduction zone like this one, because a lot of people watching this live closer to a sleeping gap than they realize. And if you're new here, here's what you're signing up for. Every week we take one real current Earth science risk and break it down using the actual research behind it, not just the scary headline sitting on top of it. No hype for hype's sake, just the mechanism. Explained like you're 11 years old, because that's the only way it actually sticks. If this is useful to you, hit like now, not to help the channel, but because it tells the algorithm to put this in front of someone else who's standing on a fault line and doesn't know it yet. Okay, let's get into it. To understand why a gap is dangerous, you have to understand what's actually happening under the Alaska Peninsula, and honestly, under most of the Pacific coastline in the world. Picture two enormous rocky conveyor belts. One of them is the Pacific Plate, a slab of ocean floor about 60 miles thick. It is sliding very slowly underneath a second slab, the North American Plate, which is what Alaska sits on top of. This sliding under another plate process has a name, subduction, which just means one slab is diving beneath another, like a bulldozer blade sliding under a pile of dirt. Now here's the part that matters. That sliding motion is not smooth. It is not like two pieces of wet glass gliding past each other. It's more like two pieces of sandpaper being dragged against one another, except the sandpaper is the size of a country and it's being dragged by forces from deep inside the planet that never stop pushing. Most of the time, that friction locks the two plates together. They don't slide at all. They just stick. And while they're stuck, the plate underneath keeps trying to dive down anyway because the forces driving it never take a break. So what happens to all that motion if the plates are stuck and not actually sliding? It doesn't disappear. It gets stored. Think about a rubber band. If you hook one end to a doorknob and start walking backward, you're not moving the doorknob, you're just stretching the band. All that energy from your walking is sitting inside the stretched rubber waiting. The ground under the Alaska Peninsula is doing the same thing right now at this exact moment as you're listening to this. The Pacific Plate is trying to dive under North America. It's being blocked at this locked patch, and the rock around that patch is bending, stretching, storing energy, the same way that rubber band stores the energy of your steps. Eventually, one of two things happens. Either the rubber band gets returned to its natural length slowly, which almost never happens with rock, because rock is stiff and rock breaks before it bends smoothly, or the band snaps back all at once. In earthquake terms, snapping back all at once means the locked patch finally slips. Years, sometimes centuries, of stored motion get released in a matter of seconds. That sudden release is what shakes the ground, That's an earthquake. This isn't a theory dreamed up in a lab. Alaska has already shown the world exactly what this looks like in one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded on modern instruments. Back in 1964, a massive rupture tore through a different section of this same general subduction system in what's now called the Great Alaska Earthquake. That single event lasted for several minutes, which is almost unimaginable if you've only ever felt a small tremor that's over in a few seconds. Sections of coastline dropped by several feet in an instant. Whole hillsides slid into the sea. And the tsunami it generated didn't just hit Alaska, it crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and still caused damage and loss of life as far away as California. That earthquake happened because a different locked patch, on a different part of this same bent bow of fault line, finally ran out of room to keep hiding its stress. The gap we're talking about today is a different patch, further along that same bow that hasn't done that yet. So when I say locked, I don't mean gently snug. I mean locked the way a bolt rusts into a door frame after decades of never being opened, while someone on the other side keeps leaning on it a little harder every single year. The rubber band analogy works because it's honest about the physics, but the 1964 earthquake is the proof that the analogy isn't just a comparison. It's a description of something that has already happened in this exact region within living memory for some of the people who still live along this coastline today. Now here's why a gap specifically worries scientists more than a place that shakes all the time. If a section of fault has lots of small earthquakes regularly, that's actually a decent sign. It usually means the plates there are sliding past each other in small increments, releasing stress bit by bit, like letting a little air out of a tire instead of holding all the pressure in. But a gap is different. A gap is a section that has stayed locked, stayed quiet, for an unusually long time, while the sections on either side of it have already ruptured. That quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the energy isn't being released in small pieces. It's building, silently, underneath the quiet. Picture that locked door again, the one I mentioned at the start. On one side of that door, the ocean floor is pushing, has been pushing for decades, hasn't stopped for one single second. On the other side, the door is bolted. Every year that door stays shut, more pressure builds up behind it. And the scary part isn't that the door is shut right now. The scary part is that the door has to open eventually because the thing pushing on it never gets tired. This particular gap sits along the Alaska Peninsula, part of the larger Aleutian Alaska Subduction Zone, which is one of the longest, most active subduction systems on Earth. To give you a sense of scale, this single fault system stretches for roughly 2,000 miles, curling from mainland Alaska out along the Aleutian Islands like a bent bow. Different sections of that bow have ruptured at different times throughout the last century, some of them in genuinely massive earthquakes. But in between those ruptured sections, researchers have identified segments, including the one we're talking about today, that have stayed stubbornly locked decade after decade, while their neighbors let go. So how did anyone even figure this out? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because finding a seismic gap isn't like finding a crack in a sidewalk. You can't just look at the ground and see it. You have to reconstruct it, almost like solving a cold case using decades of scattered clues. The first clue came from something that sounds almost too simple to matter: patience and a very long memory. Scientists who study subduction zones started keeping careful records of every earthquake above a certain size along coastlines like this one, going back over 100 years in some cases, using old seismograph records, historical newspaper accounts of shaking, and even oral histories from coastal communities describing tsunamis their grandparents had survived. When you lay all of those earthquakes out on a map, over time, in order, a pattern starts to emerge. Some sections of the fault light up again and again. Other sections just don't. They sit there, quiet, for the entire length of the record. That quiet was the first clue. But quiet alone doesn't prove anything, because maybe those sections are quiet because they're not actually locked. Maybe they're sliding smoothly and safely, with no stress building at all. So researchers needed a second kind of evidence, something that could tell them whether the ground itself was actually being squeezed. That's where GPS comes in, and this is honestly the part of the story I find the most fascinating, because it uses a tool most of us carry in our pocket every day, just pointed at something enormous instead of a street map. Scientists installed extremely sensitive GPS stations directly on the ground along the Alaska Peninsula, machines precise enough to detect ground movement measured in millimeters per year. And here's what they found. In the sections of coastline that had already ruptured in past earthquakes, the ground was moving the way you'd expect, slowly creeping in the same direction as the plate motion underneath. But in the gap, the ground was barely moving at all. It was being held in place, locked. That was the second clue, and it lined up perfectly with the first one. A section of coastline with no recorded large earthquakes in the historical record, and ground that wasn't moving the way physics said it should if it were actually sliding freely. Two completely different kinds of evidence, one built from old records and human memory, one built from cutting-edge satellite positioning, both pointing at the exact same patch of ocean floor. But there was a third clue, and this one didn't come from instruments at all. It came from the mud. Researchers who study coastal geology along subduction zones have learned to read old tsunamis the way a detective reads fingerprints, by digging shallow pits into coastal marshes and looking at the layers of soil underneath. When a tsunami sweeps over a marsh, it drops a thin layer of ocean sand on top of the normal, dark, plant-rich soil that was already there. Then, life goes on. Grass grows back, regular soil builds up again on top of that sand layer. Then, decades or centuries later, another tsunami hits, and it lays down another thin sheet of sand on top of that. Over hundreds, or even thousands of years, you end up with something that looks almost like the rings inside a tree stump, except instead of counting years, you're counting tsunamis. By carbon dating the plant material trapped between those sand layers, researchers can build a timeline of major earthquakes going back long before anyone was around to write them down. When scientists did this kind of digging along different sections of the Alaska Peninsula coastline, these and layers told a very specific story. In places next to the gap, the layers showed repeated tsunami events, spaced out fairly evenly over centuries, matching what you'd expect from a fault that ruptures every so often and releases its stress. But in the gap itself, that pattern was different, or in some spots, oddly absent, hinting that this segment might behave differently than its neighbors, possibly rupturing less often, but potentially building up more stress each time as a result. That's the reveal. That's how you find a gap you can't actually see with your own eyes. You don't look for the earthquake, you look for the silence that shouldn't be there in the historical record and the satellite data, and even buried in layers of sand under a marsh, and then you check whether all three tell the same story. Here, they did. In just the past few years, that quiet has started to shift. Seismic monitoring stations along the Alaska Peninsula have recorded an uptick in smaller earthquakes clustering right around the edges of this locked section, what scientists sometimes call a seismic swarm, a cluster of small quakes happening in a tight area over a relatively short window of time. On its own, a swarm doesn't mean a big earthquake is coming next week or next year. Small earthquakes happen constantly, all over active fault systems, and most of them just release a tiny bit of stress and nothing else follows. But a swarm concentrated right at the boundary of a known locked gap is exactly the kind of signal that makes researchers who study this system sit up and pay closer attention, because it can mean the edges of that locked patch are starting to feel the strain building up in the middle. Before we get to the big numbers, let's talk about a small one, because it's the one that makes everything else make sense. The Pacific Plate is diving under Alaska at a rate of roughly 2 to 3 inches per year. That's it. That's about how fast your fingernails grow. It sounds almost harmless when you put it that way, doesn't it? But here's the trick. Your fingernails don't have 50 years or 100 years to keep growing without ever being trimmed. This locked patch does. 2 or 3 inches doesn't sound like much for 1 year, but multiply that by 50 years of a fault staying locked, and you're talking about 10 or more feet of built-up, unreleased motion, all stored as stress in rock that has nowhere else to put it. That's the entire engine behind everything we've been discussing. A tiny, boring fingernail speed number multiplied by decades of patience into something enormous. Let's talk numbers for a second, because I promised you real numbers, and I promised you I'd never leave one sitting there without translating it. Subduction zone earthquakes are measured on a magnitude scale, and here's the thing about that scale that trips almost everyone up. It isn't a straight line. Each whole number jump doesn't mean a little more powerful. A magnitude 8 earthquake releases roughly 32 times more energy than a magnitude 7. Not double, not triple, 32 times. And a magnitude 9 releases roughly 32 times more energy than that magnitude 8. So the jump from a big earthquake to a historic earthquake isn't like walking up one extra stair step. It's like comparing a bottle rocket to a demolition charge that levels a city block. Subduction zones like this one are capable of producing the largest earthquakes on Earth, magnitude 8 and above, sometimes reaching magnitude 9, because unlike most other fault types, the locked patch that ruptures isn't just a line. It's an enormous flat surface, sometimes hundreds of miles long and dozens of miles wide, all letting go at once. To translate that into something you can picture, imagine the entire floor of a stadium the size of a small state suddenly dropping and lurching forward by several feet, all in the same 10 to 30 seconds. That's roughly the scale of ground motion involved in the largest subduction earthquakes on record. And because this is happening under the ocean floor, there's a second consequence that matters just as much as the shaking itself. The seafloor itself gets shoved upward or downward as the plates release. When you suddenly lift or drop a slab of ocean floor the size of a small country, you don't just get an earthquake. You displace an enormous volume of water sitting right on top of it. That displaced water has to go somewhere, and what it does is spread outward in all directions as a wave. That's what a tsunami actually is, It isn't a giant wave crashing down like in the movies. In the open ocean, it can be barely a foot tall, moving under a boat so gently the crew doesn't even notice it passing. But as it approaches shallow water near a coastline, that wave slows down and stacks up on itself, sometimes reaching heights of 10, 20, even over 30 feet in the most extreme historical cases, arriving not as one wave, but as a series of surges that can keep coming for hours. To put the energy involved into perspective one more way, seismologists have estimated that the very largest subduction earthquakes on record, the magnitude 9+ events, release energy on the scale of tens of thousands of the largest nuclear weapons ever tested, all delivered into solid rock instead of into the air. I want to be careful here, because that comparison can sound like pure shock value, and that's not what I'm going for. The point isn't to scare you with a big scary number for its own sake. The point is to help you understand why an earthquake at this scale doesn't just rattle windows. It physically reshapes coastlines in minutes in ways that normally take rivers and glaciers thousands of years to accomplish. And here's something that might actually ease your mind a little. Watching this stress build is no longer limited to GPS stations sitting on dry land. In the last couple of decades, researchers have started placing specialized instruments directly on the ocean floor itself, right on top of the locked patch, using pressure sensors and seafloor positioning equipment that can detect the ocean floor rising or sinking by fractions of an inch. This is genuinely difficult technology to build and maintain, since it has to survive freezing, crushing pressure and total darkness for years at a time, gathering data and either storing it or transmitting it back. To searchers on shore, every one of these instruments added to a gap like this one means less guessing and more actual measurement, which is exactly the kind of progress that turns a mysterious, silent patch of ocean floor into something scientists can watch change in close to real time. Now, before this gets away from us, I need to stop into something I promised you at the start of this video. I need to knock down the myth that always shows up in the comments section anytime a video like this gets posted. And the myth goes like this: scientists are just saying this to get funding. Or this is a government cover-up, or worse, someone predicted the exact date this is going to happen. None of that holds up, and here's why, in plain terms. Earthquake prediction, meaning a specific date, a specific time, a specific magnitude, announced in advance, does not exist anywhere in the world, in any country, using any technology currently available to us. It isn't a secret that's being withheld. It's a limit of the science itself. What we can do, and what this entire video has been describing, is identify where stress is building up, and estimate the range of what's possible if that stress releases. That's forecasting a risk, the same way a doctor can tell you that smoking dramatically raises your risk of certain diseases without being able to tell you the exact day you'll get sick. Nobody studying this fault knows if it ruptures next month or in 30 years. What they do know, with real, measured, repeatable evidence, is that the stress is there, and it isn't going away on its own. It's also worth saying plainly that an uptick in small earthquakes doesn't automatically mean researchers believe a massive rupture is coming soon. Swarms like this happen periodically along active fault systems all over the world, and most of the time, they simply fade out again without leading to anything larger. What makes this particular swarm worth a video, worth your attention, isn't panic, it's location. It's happening right at the edge of a patch that independent evidence, historical records, GPS measurements, and sediment layers had already flagged as locked and under stress long before this recent activity even started. That's the difference between a headline built to scare you and a pattern worth actually understanding. Here's the part that's actually good news, though, and I mean that seriously. A gap being locked and under stress does not automatically mean a massive earthquake is imminent in the sense of any day now. Some locked sections stay locked for very long stretches of human time, sometimes far longer than a single lifetime, before finally releasing. And when it comes to what's often called slow slip, some subduction zones have been found to release a portion of their built-up stress gradually over weeks or months through movement too slow to even feel, almost like the rubber band very slowly being let out instead of snapping all at once. Researchers are still working out how much of that gradual release happens at this specific gap, and that uncertainty is worth being honest about. Scientists genuinely don't fully agree yet on exactly how much of the stress here might release slowly versus all at once, and that's not a weakness in the science, that's just where the research currently stands. But I do want to walk you through the secondary risk here, the one people almost never think about, because it's not the shaking itself, it's what the shaking does to everything built on top of it. This coastline isn't empty. Communities here depend on fishing infrastructure, on airstrips that are often the only way in or out during a storm, on power systems and fuel storage that keep small towns running through brutal winters. A large earthquake doesn't just shake buildings. It can trigger landslides on unstable coastal slopes, it can rupture underground fuel lines, it can knock out the only bridge connecting a community to its own airport. And because a lot of Alaska's coastal terrain includes loose, waterlogged soil near the shoreline, there's a process called liquefaction that becomes a real danger during strong shaking. Liquefaction is what happens when shaking causes wet, sandy ground to briefly behave like a liquid instead of a solid, the same way wet sand at the beach turns soupy if you stomp on it hard enough and fast enough. Buildings, pipelines, even entire sections of road can sink, tilt, or collapse into ground that used to be solid enough to build on. This pattern, a locked gap sitting quietly between two sections that already ruptured, isn't unique to Alaska, and that's actually important context. In 2004, a section of the seafloor off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia had been building stress for centuries before it finally let go in one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, triggering a tsunami that crossed the entire Indian Ocean and caused devastating loss of life across multiple countries. In 2011, off the coast of Japan, a similarly locked section of subduction zone ruptured in the Tohoku earthquake, generating a tsunami that overwhelmed seawalls that had been built based on estimates that turned out to be too conservative for what that particular patch of fault was actually capable of producing. In both cases, afterward, scientists went back and found the same kind of warning signs we've been discussing here. Long, quiet, locked patches, GPS stations recording ground that wasn't moving the way it should, and in some cases, decades-old research papers that had flagged the danger clearly, years before anyone acted on it. I'm not telling you this to suggest Alaska's gap is guaranteed to follow the same path. I'm telling you this because the pattern itself has already been proven real, more than once, in more than one country. And that's exactly why researchers take a gap like this one seriously long before anything dramatic happens. There's another secondary consequence worth sitting with for a moment, one that has nothing to do with buildings or roads at all, what happens to the ocean itself and to the people whose entire livelihood depends on it. This stretch of Alaska supports one of the largest commercial fishing economies in the country, and that economy runs on a very tight, very physical supply chain. Boats need working harbors, harbors need functioning docks and fuel stations, and processing plants need reliable power to freeze and ship the catch before it spoils. A major earthquake doesn't just threaten homes, it can knock out that entire chain at once in a region where fishing isn't just a job, it's the thing that keeps small, remote towns economically alive. Underwater landslides triggered by strong shaking can also damage the seafloor habitats that fish and shellfish populations depend on, adding a slower, quieter kind of damage that shows up in fishing halls for seasons afterward, long after the shaking itself is a memory. I want to pull back from the edge here for a second, because that's a lot to sit with, and I don't want to leave you spiraling in it. Here's the release valve. Unlike a lot of natural disasters, subduction zone risk is one of the most well-understood, well-studied hazards in all of Earth science. This isn't some brand new mystery we stumbled onto last year. Scientists have been studying subduction earthquakes and the tsunamis they generate for well over a century, and every major earthquake in a zone like this one adds more data, more understanding, and more improvements to warning systems, building codes, and evacuation planning. The gap being awake in terms of increased small earthquake activity is exactly the kind of signal that gets this system more attention, more monitoring equipment, and more public awareness, not less. You watching this video right now, taking 2 minutes to actually understand how this works, is part of that same process. But let's go one layer deeper on the secondary consequence, because there's something most people never consider, the compounding timeline problem. If a major earthquake strikes this stretch of coastline, the first wave of danger is the shaking itself, lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to, in the most extreme subduction events on record, several minutes. The second wave of danger, arriving within minutes for the closest communities, is the tsunami. But the third wave of danger, the one almost nobody plans for, is what happens in the days and weeks after, when a remote coastal region has to survive with damaged roads, damaged airstrips, and damaged fuel and power infrastructure, all while emergency responders are stretched across an enormous, sparsely populated area. In a place like the Alaska Peninsula, where some communities are only reachable by boat or small plane even on a good day, the disaster doesn't end when the shaking stops. It just changes shape. Okay, I told you at the start that the hard part comes first, and we've been in the hard part for a while now. So let's talk about what actually changes outcomes, because this is the part of the video that matters more than any of the scary numbers I just walked you through. If you live anywhere near a coastline, and especially if you live near a subduction zone like this one, whether that's Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, Japan, Chile, Indonesia, or anywhere else along the Ring of Fire, there are a small number of things that consistently save lives, and none of them require you to panic. First, know your evacuation zone before you ever need it. Most coastal communities near tsunami-capable faults have mapped publicly available evacuation routes, usually posted at beaches, harbors, and town entrances. Find yours now, while you're calm, not during an emergency. Second, learn the natural warning signs. Because in a local earthquake, the shaking itself is your warning, There may be no time for an official alert before a wave arrives. If you feel strong or prolonged shaking near a coastline, and especially if you ever see the ocean pull back unusually far, exposing seafloor that's normally underwater, that is not a moment to grab your phone and take a video. That's a moment to move to higher ground immediately. On foot, ice roads might be jammed or damaged. Third, keep a basic emergency kit that doesn't require any special skill to assemble. Enough water for at least 3 days per person, a battery or hand crank radio so you can receive information if power and cell service go down, a flashlight, basic first aid supplies, and a physical paper copy of important documents and phone numbers because your phone might not have power or signal when you need it most. Fourth, know where your gas and water shutoff valves are, and know how to use them because after strong shaking, damaged lines can turn a survivable earthquake into a fire or flooding hazard inside your own home. And fifth, and honestly, this might be the most overlooked one, talk to your neighbors about this stuff before anything happens. In small coastal communities especially, the people who check on each other in the first chaotic hour after a disaster are almost always the reason survival rates improve. Preparedness isn't just a personal checklist. It's a community habit. There are a couple more habits worth building, and they're smaller than you'd think. Sixth, if you travel to or live in a coastal community near a subduction zone, take 5 minutes to check whether your phone's emergency alert settings are turned on, because many regions now push tsunami and earthquake alerts directly to phones, but only if those settings haven't been quietly switched off somewhere in your notification preferences. Seventh, if you have kids or elderly family members or anyone in your household who might panic or freeze during sudden shaking, practice the plan with them now, calmly, like a fire drill, so that the response becomes automatic instead of something they have to think through for the first time while the ground is actually moving. And eighth, if you're ever in a boat or near a harbor when strong shaking happens, know that the standard guidance from coastal safety agencies is to move the boat out to deeper water if there's time, because a tsunami is far more dangerous in shallow harbors and near shorelines than it is out in open, deep water, where the wave hasn't yet stacked up into something dangerous. And one more, ninth point, that rarely gets mentioned in videos like this, but genuinely matters. If you own property in an earthquake or tsunami-prone coastal area, it's worth checking now, not after an event, whether your homeowner's or renter's insurance actually covers earthquake and flood damage, because in many places, those are separate policies. You have to add on purpose, and standard coverage quietly excludes them by default. Nobody wants to think about paperwork in the middle of a video about locked faults and tsunamis, but paperwork done calmly in advance is exactly the kind of boring preparation that saves people from a second disaster, a financial one stacked right on top of the first. None of this requires you to live in fear of a door under the ocean that might not open for years or decades. It just means that if it ever does open, you're not standing there confused about what to do next. Preparedness like this isn't about assuming the worst is coming tomorrow. It's about making sure that if it ever does come on any timeline, you and the people around you already know exactly what the next 10 minutes look like. One last thing before we close, because I think it matters more than most disaster videos give it credit for. None of what you just heard is meant to make you feel powerless, and none of it is meant to make you feel like you personally have to solve a problem this size on your own. The truth is, the people who live along coastlines like this one have been adapting to exactly this kind of risk for generations, long before satellites or seismographs existed. Building codes in earthquake-prone regions have gotten dramatically better over the last 50 years, specifically because of lessons learned from events like the 1964 Alaska earthquake. Tsunami warning systems that barely existed decades ago now cover most of the Pacific Rim, capable of alerting coastal communities within minutes of a triggering earthquake. Evacuation routes are mapped, tested, and refined after every real event, not left as static signs nobody ever updates. None of that erases the risk, but all of it means that a community facing this gap today is facing it with tools, knowledge, and infrastructure that simply did not exist the last time a section of this fault let go. That's not a reason to stop paying attention. It's a reason to trust that paying attention and preparing calmly actually works.